Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. I'm your host, Alex, as always, here to talk to you about a 30-13 Chargers Sunday Night Football win over the Bears, where they kind of got everything back on track. As Staley said in the post-game press conference, they played a complete three-phase game, which I think was promising to see. Promising to see Herbert bounce back and the offense bounce back and all these things after the last couple weeks. How much of this game do you take forward to the Jets or the Lions game, given, that it was the Bears? I don't know in terms of success, but I do think there was some, good positive signs in this game, both offensively and defensively, that you can just take going forward. Some negative stuff too, particularly one thing I want to harp on defense, but we'll get to all of that and more. And I do want to talk a little bit of trade deadline when we get to that topic. So that is going to be Tuesday. So I just want to talk a little bit at the end of this video about kind of what the, attitude and approach for the Chargers should be kind of going into that period now that they, obviously are not going to be sellers at the deadline. I think after this win, I think this, is a small buy or they stand pat type of situation. So I'll talk about some of the things that go into that as well. But let's start with the offense. I thought this was a really good Justin Herbert game, all things considered. We always kind of start by talking about him, and 300 yards, 3 touchdowns, pretty standard performance. A couple risky throws here and there. There was the one where he got away with an interception right before the half that, they were still allowed to kick the field goal. So that happened. But overall for the Herbert in this game, if you're not nitpicking, this was, a return to form. And it was just nice to see him have a game, post, the finger injury, because what we had really seen is the Raiders game live when it happened, and then Dallas and Kansas City, where, obviously in Kansas City, he still was dealing with this finger thing, just was wearing the splint today, no glove, and it seemed to go a lot better. I think he did bobble the first snap, but overall, that was the 1 yard he got on a scramble, as I'm seeing on the ESPN box score right now. But overall, he looked a lot more comfortable and just sort of started spreading the ball around to everyone. It was obviously getting Ekeler involved near the line, which was huge again for this offense, because I always talk about Ekeler from a gravity perspective, like, just what he's able to do near the line of scrimmage and break a ball for, 30, 40 yards. It's pretty impressive, so the Chargers have missed that component, I think, over the last 2 weeks in particular, their offense, because you've had guys like Dan Quinn and Steve Spagnuolo on the opposing sidelines that have really keyed in on like limiting the big Ekeler play. Back to Herbert, like I think he did a good job of getting Ekeler, Johnston, Palmer, Donald Parham, Keenan Allen, like everybody involved in this game, even Simi Fehoko on a mesh touchdown route, which was, crazy to see live. Honestly, was watching the game and I was like, is that Alex Erickson? Simi Fehoko? When I first saw somebody of a lighter complexion taking snaps at wide receiver. So then I found out Alex Erickson was inactive, and that was indeed Simi Fehoko. So continuing the long line of iconic Chargers moments from the Fehoko family. So I was happy to see that from Simi just getting involved. And, at that point, there was this feeling of like, okay, well, like, when's Quentin Johnston going to get involved? And then Quentin Johnston got involved pretty soon after that. Obviously, had the big 2-minute drive where he was pretty consistently involved in the drive that resulted in the Donald Parham touchdown. And so it was nice to see, in terms of things that we can bring forward with us into these games in terms of success. I do think like Herbert looking at Quentin Johnston and being able to trust him in a big moment, I like a 2-minute drill, like that is something that matters. Obviously had the comeback route, ran a couple like drags on that drive that ended up pretty well. So, big ups to QJ, 5 catches, 50 yards. I think he converted 4 first downs, and in addition to the defensive pass interference. So I think he converted 5 total on the night, which is pretty good game for QJ, all things considered. It felt like this was, maybe a mandated game to get him involved, but it never felt like Herbert was intentionally like trying to go after anyone in that way. It just felt like he was, again, having a very good Herbert game, kind of like letting the game flow to him and not intentionally kind of like staring down his targets, which had been an issue in previous weeks. So it was nice to see him again spread the ball around a little bit in this game. Helps that the offensive line had the game that they had. A couple free rusher, issues in the second half, but ultimately I think you had Jamar Salyer give up 2 pressures, and you have 1 pressure each from all the rest of the offensive linemen. So 5 pressures from the O-line is much better than what it had been previously, where against Dallas and Kansas City, and even the Raiders, they had been, the whole offensive line was giving up 10 plus, 15 plus pressures in some of these games. So it was nice to see them return back to earth a little bit in that regard. And Slater played pretty well last week, actually, against the Chiefs. But to see the entire offensive line just sort of get back to what things are supposed to look like, I think was really nice. And obviously that helped Herbert, helped the whole offense flow. Not much from the running game in this one. I think Ekeler finished with 15 carries for 29 yards. Joshua Kelly went 6 for 21. But yeah, ultimately just not a ton of momentum there. I think they sort of prioritized the passing game anyway, although the inability to run is a little bit concerning if we're talking about something from the offense, because we've kind of seen it now sort of 3 weeks in a row. A little bit they were able to run against Kansas City, which was nice, but didn't lead to much meaningful, play creation outside of that Joshua Kelly touchdown. So I don't know. I hope that this run game does get going a little bit more and that they can go to it more consistently. But yeah, tonight just wasn't the night for that. I think the passing game working, Herbert going through his progressions and all that stuff, and Ekeler being involved in the receiving game, right? That takes a lot of the juice out of the run game to some extent. So they never, strung those consistent drives together. But going forward, I would like to see the run game be a little bit better, especially against some of the better defensive fronts they'll play with the Jets and some of the other defenses going forward. So, would like to see the running game more involved, but if the passing game is more involved and it's a Herbert 300-yard touchdown, 3-touchdown game, I'm certainly not going to complain. Trying to think of any other, sort of notes that I have on offense. Obviously, we talked about getting Quentin involved. Donald Parham, credit to him. He had 4 catches for 43 yards and the touchdown in this one. And I was a little bit worried of how he would look as tight end 1, not necessarily from strictly a receiving perspective, but also blocking. Parham is a pretty league average to slightly below average blocker. So him taking over for Everett was, pretty big in this one, as he was unable to play with the hip injury. And then you just had McKitty and Smart behind him. So, I'm sure the PFF blocking scores for McKitty and Smart are not going to look great in the morning, as they usually don't. But, Parham stepped up in a pretty big way from a receiving perspective, and I think he looked pretty okay as a blocker relative to what he looked at last week on film. So, we'd have to watch back the game to see exactly how he played as a blocker, but overall, pretty good stuff from him, all things considered. And, I wonder if the gears turn in Kellen's head a little bit to be like, okay, obviously we're going to have Gerald Everett involved as our main tight end from, 20 to 20 yard line before Parham gets involved in the red zone. But Parham in the open field, didn't look bad. I wouldn't mind seeing a little bit more of him from the 20 to 20 yard line, especially because, as Collinsworth pointed out in the broadcast, you have this 6'8" guy at the line of scrimmage that you're like, what the hell do I do with this? And I do think it, again, creates more of those mismatches. Maybe the Chargers want to play it careful, kind of avoid injury and some of the things like that we've talked about with Parham in the past, and preserve him as that red zone target. But I do think I would like to see a little bit more of him in the open field, because he played pretty well today. Josh Palmer, as I said, 3 catches for 28 yards, re-aggravated that knee injury pretty badly in the first half, did come back to play the second half, but quite clearly wasn't the same. I don't think he ended up playing as many snaps. I think he had 2 fewer snaps than Quentin Johnston in this game as a result of missing that time at the end of the first half and then not playing quite as much in the second. Had a pretty significant limp after the post-game press conference. Or not that he had a press conference, but just that was visible with a limp, in the locker room and all these things. So, I hope that he's okay. This could also, when we talk about trade deadline stuff and potentially trading for a wide receiver, like factor into what the Chargers decide to do over the next 48 hours, depending on whether, Parham is okay. I mean, I think we all know he's okay, but again, like, how many games is it going to take for him to get right if they decide that they need to rest him, if they decide that he, just has to play through the injury, whatever kind of the medical staff and team training sort of decide. But Josh Palmer had been playing really good in the last 2 weeks against Kansas City and Dallas. So it's really unfortunate to kind of lose him in this one in the way that they did, especially because they're really thin at wide receiver right now. And obviously this is where not having Mike Williams looms really significant. So yeah, hope Josh Palmer's okay. Hope the team as a whole just continues to stay healthy. Largely, can't remember many other injuries in this game. I know Asante Samuel Jr. got a little bit shaken up, but it seemed like he was okay. Overall, didn't pop up or was mentioned on any injury stuff after the game. I guess we'll see in practice reports this week. But yeah, overall, like pretty good game from the offense, just in terms of, again, getting right. I don't know how much of this is like transitionable to, hey, we're going to play the Jets, and the Jets are a really smart coached defensive team, and they're going to try to take your best things away from you. But I think I saw a Chargers offense that was much more akin to a 2022 game where they just, they never panicked. It was like, we're going to take what's available to us. Herbert was going through his progressions, going through his reads fine. And, I think we saw obviously the difference between Herbert under pressure and being consistently pressured for 15 to 20 times a game versus what it looks like when he's pressured 5 times a game, right? Like, that's just kind of difference in what we saw tonight. So obviously you're not going to go against the Bears line every week, but also to give credit to the Chargers and what they talk about with the defensive fronts, you're also not going to go against the Chiefs and the Raiders and the Cowboys, 3 of the best defensive line, monster groups kind of in the league when we talk about obviously the premium players that they have in Chris Jones and Micah Parsons and Max Crosby. So hopefully, I think the offensive line overall played better. I hope they take that as a sign of things kind of going forward, have a challenge against the Jets defensive front going forward and how they sort of simulate quarterback pressures. And that defense in general is pretty nasty from Saleh. So they'll have a lot to deal with there, but don't want to get too ahead of ourselves now. But ultimately, yeah, pretty good game from the offense. And I was just, it was nice to see a normal offensive game where things looked okay. Talking about the defense, Joey Bosa looked really good in this game. And I think let me just check the numbers real quick. I think he ended up leading the edge, or I think he was one off of Khalil Mack from a snap standpoint. Yeah, Khalil Mack had 39 snaps, Joey Bosa 38 snaps. Tuli with 34 and Rumpf with 20. So he played pretty much a full workload in this game. And it was nice to see that from Joey Bosa. Obviously had the sack very early in this game, had 5. I think he led the team in pressures with 5. So it did feel like, okay, the Joey Bosa is back game. It was nice. I think they talked about him. This is the first week he wasn't on the injury report in quite a while with, something related to the toe, related to the hamstring. So the fact that he is feeling a lot better and got through that point in the season where it was significantly limiting his production, I think is a big win for the Chargers. And when you talk about things kind of coming out of this game that they can apply to their next couple games, getting, a version of Joey Bosa back that is much more, akin to, him playing at his best versus when he's injured, I think would be a big win for them. Khalil Mack, 3 pressures, and then you had a bunch of guys who also had 1 in Sebastian Joseph Day, Tuli, Fox, Matlock, Kenneth Murray also. So yeah, ultimately, like, pretty good game from the defensive line. Obviously, it's sort of taking what the Bears give you to some extent with the state of that offensive line right now. But I liked seeing what they were doing just from a pass rushing standpoint and from a run defense standpoint too. I think that the Bears ended up averaging 2.9 yards per carry on about 25 carries, which, I talked about in this game, how much do I believe in the Chargers run defense? The Bears coming into this game had 513 rushing yards in their last 3 games. So I'm like, okay, you want to talk about a litmus test. You want to talk about a stress test. This Bears team could give the Chargers some problems in that regard. And so I'm very fortunate that that wasn't the case, and the Chargers held firm, and they are top 5 in a lot of like rush defense EPA metrics and in terms of what they've been doing this season against the run. So it was nice to see that continue. Um, I don't know if the run defense is like truly fixed, but we have a large enough sample size now where they are, one of the better run defenses in the league. Is that going to hold? I don't know, but it does feel like, again, and Staley talked about this, Joey Bosa looking better in the run game. Joey Bosa bulked up in the offseason to put up, some better performances against the run, as far as the edges with him and Mac. And then it feels like the run fits on the interior are better too, because, you did see a lot of times last season where, just sequences in games where teams didn't even have to throw the ball. Like they could just run the ball right up the gut and it would create some explosive play. And because of a missed tackle or run to the outside against the Chargers, people feasted last year. And so the fact that the Chargers have regressed a little bit to the mean in terms of their run defense, even if, things aren't necessarily perfect, the fact that they are playing and are statistically like a top 10, top 5 defense against the run is very impressive. We'll see how much that holds against Breece Hall and these other matchups they have going forward. But I think that that's a very, very promising sign. If you're talking about this team as a playoff contender or, trying to get back into that race, if we're talking about things that are different from last year that are positive, I think that is absolutely, one of them. So Kenneth Murray's been pretty good against the run too. I think that's kind of changed since, he's gotten the green dot back, is that he feels more sure of what he's supposed to do in the run game. And I think really all 3 levels of the defense are connecting pretty well in that regard. Talk about the secondary. I think you had John Derwin get picks in this game. Alohi Gilman again forces a pretty big hit on a Bears receiver and then jars that ball loose. Derwin gets the pick. So they had Badgent's number in this game. Like kind of knew where he was throwing to, and also Badgent like telegraphed a couple of those throws. To be honest, so this was not the best like Tyson Badgent masterclass game that the Chargers stopped. But I still think, you look at what the Chargers kind of did in this one. The approach in the secondary was interesting because I think that they wanted to be super aggressive when Pageant threw short, to some extent. But then they also just still, like, the one criticism I'll have defensively is like they still are kind of doing the soft zone thing. There was a big third down that DJ Moore converted where nobody was within like 5 to 10 yards of it, and that allowed the Bears to get a touchdown before halftime. And then, a couple plays in the first half where Velus Jones got behind the defense. What am I thinking? The one that started the game with Darnell Mooney beating Asante Samuel Jr. So like still sometimes when they're not like playing super uptight, super close, like, it's not going to cost you too much against the Bears, and the Bears didn't make the most of those opportunities when they had that, big play to gun for against the Chargers. But I still feel like in my heart, like this is something that's going to cost them against the Ravens. Like this is something that's going to cost them against the Lions, right? Against teams that have the offensive resources and the offensive ingenuity in terms of scheme to scheme better when they see the off coverage. And then Staley at halftime talking about, we got to put a roof on the defense and all that. Like, I felt the best plays in this game where, the Chargers kind of playing up close, tight to the line of scrimmage. The soft zone stuff did create some opportunities, but it also gave some life to the Bears offensively that they otherwise maybe wouldn't have had in this game. So I thought that was still a little bit perplexing storyline to watch going forward. But ultimately, look, they gave up 13 points to the Bears, came away with 2 picks, were, a force kind of in the backfield against the run, pass pressuring all night. Not a lot to complain about defensively. So ultimately, I thought from that standpoint, the Chargers did a really good job of just, playing their brand of football and playing a complete defense, as a complete defense for the first time in a while, where it felt like all 3 levels of the defense kind of knew what they were supposed to do on every play. There had been these like mismatches and play breaks in previous games where I feel like, somebody was out of position and then that created a big play opportunity. Obviously, we saw what happened with the Chiefs last week. Another example of that game, I think, was Miami and Tennessee earlier in the year. So the fact that they are, communicating at a higher level to some extent, I think the fact that they are, just playing their brand of football was really nice to see. Again, how much of this was they're playing Tyson Bagent versus how much of this is, transferable when you play Jared Goff and when you play Lamar Jackson, we'll see. But I did think this was a step in the positive direction and making quarterbacks, kind of, getting the pressure on them, making them make tough decisions, right? Like, and limiting the big plays. And for the most part, they did limit the big plays as much as I talk about a couple instances of the Staley defense being frustrating. So we'll see how that transfers over the next couple weeks. Trying to think of some other standout defensive performers. I mentioned Joey. Khalil Mack had 3 pressures. Overall, like, this wasn't like an all-out like smashing like defensive effort, but I thought that this was a much better game to kind of get back on track. Obviously, again, it's the Bears, but overall, I thought they did a pretty good job in those regards with the defense. So, trying to think if there's anything I wanted to mention on special teams. Cameron Dicker, shout out to Cameron Dicker. He hit the 55-yarder last week. Follows it up with a 53-yarder in this game and 3 field goals. So, was really impressed with him and continue to be impressed with him. With the kicking competition, that wasn't really a kicking competition because of how injured Dustin Hopkins was during the preseason. Now he's balling out in Cleveland. So shout out to Dustin Hopkins. But yeah, I was confident in Cameron Dicker's ability from distance, but we also, I'm not at training camp, like, live there. So I wasn't seeing him like kick field goals and all these things in the preseason. So it was nice to see him. It's been nice to see him kind of be the kicker that the Chargers have needed to stabilize the group over the years. Obviously, kicking is a very flimsy thing in the league, and that can vary from game to game, from year to year. But it's been nice to see him do that. All right, let's talk about trade deadline. I do just want to talk about, I guess, what the approach for the Chargers should be over the next 2 days here, before Tuesday at 4 p.m. I think there's been this debate on Twitter, particularly before this game, of whether the Chargers should be buyers, whether they should be sellers. I think it's pretty clear that they're either going to be pretty small buyers or they're going to stand pat at the deadline. As far as the selling thing goes, I just think people like need to think about this as if you're an opposing GM, because, I think the people that were like, sell Bosa, sell Derwin, get the big contracts off of the team, like, NFL GMs are not going to bail you out of the financial mess you made unless they have a reason to, right? Obviously, we saw the Patriots with the JC Jackson trade. They go, we kind of need a corner because Christian Gonzalez is hurt for the rest of the year. All right, let's pull the trigger and trade for JC, right? So you have situations like that where I think a deal makes sense for both sides. If you wanted to go sell mode with the Chargers, what do they have to sell? Right? Like, this is kind of my big question when it comes to that take, is like, okay, maybe you could trade Ekeler and Everett for something as expirings, but they're probably feeling like, all right, well, we can, with the idea of comp picks, right? You let those guys walk in free agency and pick up something there because the Chargers aren't going to be active spenders in free agency this year. So, overall, they're probably going to get some type of comp pick back in that scenario, right? And then, in terms of taking on the bigger contracts or asking a team to do that, like if the Chargers really wanted to be sellers, who's picking up the phone on like, the big dead cap hits and the big, the big contract situations that the Chargers have put themselves in with guys like Derwin, with Bosa and Mac, particularly through the restructures. Like, why am I going to do that when I have better options, right? Like, this is, I think, kind of the biggest thing for me is like, again, NFL GMs aren't going to bail you out unless they have a reason to. And why am I going to trade for Derwin James potentially when I have the ability to trade for, Budda Baker or, more advantageous safety options in general that are cheaper? Why am I going to trade for potentially Joey Bosa, before before trading for Brian Burns or Chase Young or, some of these other more efficient contract options. Justin Houston, right, expiring deal also. So, in terms of being sellers on the big contracts, I just don't think the Chargers can be because I think that this regime cannot afford to sell at the deadline. Like this, it's either this year or it's not happening in terms of like their progression into the playoffs and as a contender, or you know, we would see what happens in the offseason with Staley and Telesco. So for that reason, I don't think they can sell. And then I just think, you look around the league and like they can't really be sellers on, again, the big contracts because I just don't think other teams are willing to pick them up midseason, right? Now, could you trade Joey Bosa or Khalil Mack or, somebody next year? Yeah, I think it's doable, right? If the Chargers are willing to absorb some of that money and take the dead cap hit in return for some draft capital potentially. But I still don't think they would be super. I still don't think the market on those guys would be, super high. But, we would have to see. So obviously the selling discussion is a discussion for a different day because the Chargers clearly aren't going in that direction. In terms of like being buyers, obviously they're not going to make like a big, splash at the free agency deadline. They're not trading for, Mike Evans or something like that, or a guy who's, expensive on an expiring, but I do think, they can make some smaller moves that, help the team in that standpoint. And I'm particularly looking at tight end and wide receiver. I think that they have some guys, that they liked over the course of the offseason. Jeff Swaim, they were reportedly interested in. Arizona, obviously, kind of in tank mode now to try to maybe, get some picks or pick swaps back. I think they'll probably be sellers at the deadline in some capacity with what they have on that roster. And, so I like Jeff Swaim quite a bit at tight end. Hunter Henry, if you wanted to poke around New England and be like, hey, we did you a solid with JC. You want to do us a solid back? I don't know if they would go for that. And New England, maybe after they beat Buffalo a couple weeks ago, still thinks they have a chance in this like wild card race. So who knows? But I think tight end in general is a really important position for this team to try to pursue and upgrade if they're going to be intent on being contenders this year, just because the blocking from McKitty and Smart has not been good enough. Right. And I'm not even talking about like, oh, you have to go get like a, star tight end or somebody who's available. Like I would take somebody, the Eagles aren't even playing Albert O. They've healthy scratched him in all these games. And like, I'm like, oh, shit, I would throw a 7th rounder. I can see kind of what you want to get out of somebody like Albert O, right? Because I think he'd probably be better than Trey McKitty and Stone Smart. But yeah, I think that like there's options out there that could add to their wide receiver depth, that can add to their tight end depth, that are not, Tennessee probably is not trading DeAndre Hopkins anymore after the Will Levis game. But, again, some smaller receivers are guys that just aren't playing in big roles throughout the league that the Chargers can go after, as either kind of like a buy low move or just to add depth to the wide receiver tight end groups. I know Steven and Tyler on the Saturday show mentioned Kaiir Elam and, potentially like adding him because the Bills aren't playing him. So maybe that can be like a bit of a for this season move, but also, looking towards the future to some extent if they wanted to buy in that capacity. Don't really see Telesco doing something like that because the Chargers need help this year as opposed to like next year when he may not be here. So I think if he makes any trade, it's kind of to help the team in the immediate as opposed to, kind of, buying some kind of like future asset. Even if Kaiir Elam wouldn't cost a lot, I just don't necessarily see Telesco doing that kind of a move. But yeah, I think really what it comes down to is the Chargers are either going to stand pat at the trade deadline or they're going to be small buyers on, to me, the 3 positions that I would watch are tight end, wide receiver, and I'd also look at corner, right? If they want to look at slot cornerback, Jalen Mills is a guy from New England that I think could be interesting because, he's pretty still good as a slot corner when he's placed into that role. Obviously, that kind of goes into like the Bryce Callahan sort of discussion if the Chargers wanted to boost the corner room in the secondary behind Jaw Taylor. So, yeah, I'll be curious to see what the Chargers do at the trade deadline. I'm not expecting much. I do not think they honestly will make like a move. But surprise me, right? If this is supposed to be the all-in year and you want to continue to bolster this roster, and now Josh Palmer and Mike Williams are down. Mike Williams down for the whole season. Josh Palmer, kind of going through injuries right now. I would be impressed if they got a receiver, honestly, like, or a tight end or something. Like, I just think you would feel a lot more comfortable with this roster if there was a little bit more depth, a little bit more meat on the bone. But right now, that kind of doesn't exist for a couple positions and couple spots on the roster. So we'll be curious to see what Telesco does at the trade deadline. As I said, I'm not expecting quite a lot, honestly, at this point. I don't think they're going to be big buyers, big sellers. Either, maybe one small move, or they stand pat, or they pursue free agency. That could also be a thing. Maybe, picking up some waiver guys post deadline as well, because that always happens. But that'll do it for me today. It was nice to talk to you guys after a win. I'm happy that the Chargers are, back. No, they're not back after the Bears game. It's a little too early to declare them back. But it was nice to see them play a full, complete game. So nice to see the Chargers bounce back. What else was I going to say? Oh, yeah, I am moving apartments. So sorry, my content on Twitter and stuff might be a little bit more sporadic this week. But next time you see me on the show, I guess I'll be in the new digs. So you can say goodbye to the birds and the blue wall in the background. So you'll see me in a new place next time. But yeah, really happy the Chargers got this win. On to Monday Night Football and another big primetime spot for the Chargers on the road at MetLife Stadium. As I tweeted during this game and during the Giants game today, please, I hope that the MetLife turf does not claim the life of any Chargers. I will pray to whatever gods I need to pray to for that to happen. But yeah, so overall, bolt up. See you guys next time. And fuck Chicago. Their pizza sucks, to be honest.